broke the other one.
Beautiful Bards by Bulbous Blueberries. Beautiful Bards by Bulbous Blueberries. No gnome knows what no other gnome knows. We good? We good, Jenny? We live? Hey, folks. Hey, we are live, and we are talking to the word wizard, the grammar gladiator, Scott Fitzgerald Gray. Scott, can you say hello and just quickly tell us who you are and where people can find you, real quick.
Oh, sure. My name is Scott Fitzgerald Gray. I am a freelance editor for RPGs, primarily Dungeons and Dragons. I've been working on D&D in different forms since 2004. So as I've said to many people, I finally had the job I really wanted when I was 16. And I'm hoping to hang on to it for as long as humanly possible. You can find me online, generally on Twitter, probably most easily, at Scott F. Gray. I have a website which is in dire need of updating at insaneangel.com, which has contact information on it and a little bit of info on different projects and such.
And if you were to go to insaneangel.com, you would see a lot of really cool credits that Scott has on his page. Written for Dungeon Magazine, edited for Dungeon Magazine, right?
Yep.
Design credits, edited for 3rd edition or 3.5.
Yeah, I started working. Complete Arcane was the first book I worked on, so I started sort of at that sort of slightly later stage of 3.5. Worked on a ton of stuff during 4th edition, mostly as an editor. Did a little bit of design work. Same with 3rd edition. I think I worked on 2 books as a designer. Worked on a bunch of books as an editor. A bunch of those books for third edition were from the Eberron campaign setting. Both the books I worked on as a designer and a bunch of the books that I edited were for Eberron. Did a whole bunch of stuff for fourth edition, some design work, more editing work. Worked a little bit on D&D Next, not on the playtest game itself, the rules, but did a lot of adventure editing during that period of the playtest. And then have been working on fifth edition pretty much right from the start. I was the editor for the Monster Manual and edited about half the Dungeon Master's Guide, which was pretty sublime as an experience. And I've worked on, I think, just over half the books that have come out for fifth edition up to this point.
Yeah,
which is pretty cool.
It's pretty cool because you have the images of the books that you worked on, and there are a lot of books that you worked on in D&D. It's a really cool thing that you've gotten to work on these, and I feel honored to be able to talk to you, having all the knowledge and experience that you do.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate the invitation. I like what I do, and I really love talking about it. So it's nice.
And you've also edited and helped Sly Flourish out with his fantastic adventures, fantastic locations, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and Ruins of the Grindel Root.
Yeah, Mike and I started working together. The first thing we ever worked on together was actually a Wizards of the Coast project. It was Mike, I, and Teos Abadia. We worked on the Vault of the Dracolich adventure for D&D Next. So yeah, since then, since meeting that, I've edited a bunch of stuff for Mike. We have another project we're working on now that we haven't talked about yet. It's still very much in the preliminary stages, but I'm looking forward to doing some more stuff with him and with Teos.
Cool. And you also worked with the two of them with Acquisition Incorporated, correct?
With Teos and Sean Merwin on Acquisitions.
Merwin, that's right. Yeah. Sorry, I got the two confused because Sean and Teos are on a show as well. And I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was a fun project because that was one. I mean, it's a Wizards of the Coast book. It's an official D&D release, but the three of us were all working for Penny Arcade, and we had kind of Wizards of the Coast working with us. But we, as far as the setup of the book, the vision of the book, the design of the book, all of that was done by us through the Penny Arcade side of things, and that was a really cool project to work on because it was a very different book. It did a lot of things that a traditional D&D book would not have done.
Was that
we pulled off some really cool stuff with that?
Was that hard to shift gears to do that kind of book?
Not really, no. I mean, I think I've worked on a lot of stuff. I've worked on a lot of different kinds of stuff. In addition to RPG work, I also edit fiction. I write my own fiction from time to time when I have the time, which I don't have very much of these days. I used to work in film. I've done a lot of screenplay work. I've done a lot of reading, script development work for different funding agencies, different producers, that sort of thing. So I come from a pretty eclectic creative background, I guess. I worked in traditional publishing even before that, worked in newspapers for a while, magazine work. So every project that I work on, I kind of look at it and I like the fact that everything's a little bit different than the last thing I worked on. I like the challenge of trying to figure out what a book wants to be. If it's a book like Ack Inc., where I'm playing like a lead creative role in it, I love the challenge of when I'm just, one editor among many working on a project for Wizards of the Coast. Maybe me, maybe another freelance editor, a bunch of people in-house, designer, the design team, the lead on the book, the whole kind of, the whole thing that Wizards has set up there and all the incredibly talented people they've got working on stuff. I like having that one small part of it and sort of trying to figure out where I fit into the larger picture of what everybody else is doing, right? It's a fun process for me.
And then what about your personal RPG products? You've got the Hidden Halls of Hazakor?
Hazakor, yeah. Hidden Halls of Hazakor was, just, I don't have very much stuff out. Hazakor is probably the one thing that most people might have seen or might have heard about. Hazakor it's a 5th edition adventure, which is specifically written not just for first-time DMs, but for young DMs, kind of like ages 10 to 12. And that was a project that was actually spawned out of an experience some years ago when I was running an RPG club at the middle school, where my partner's a teacher. So I wanted to set up. This was very early. This was back in the 3rd edition days. That's how long ago, how far back it was. And there were some good starter adventures out, but there wasn't really anything that sort of felt like a tutorial. So I wrote up something very, very quickly for the group, and then years later decided to dust it off and turn it into what turned into the Hazakor adventure.
Awesome. And then you've got the follow-up, The Mystery at Millwarren. Is that correct?
Mystery at Millwarren is still in progress, and it's very, very overdue. I've been working, I'm one of the luckiest people I know. I get to work on amazing books with amazing people. I've done a lot of work as a freelancer for Wizards of the Coast, which is really, really cool, working on D&D, working on the core books, working on some of the great adventures that have come out over the last 9 years or so. But the more RPG work I do for other people, the less time I have to work on my own stuff. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I have not had very much time to work on my own stuff.
Yeah,
which is really gratifying, for people to want to work with me. But at the same time, I know that there's a lot of stuff I would love to get back to. Would love to spend some more time with if I can find some time.
It's the same with freelance work, when you're trying to write your own material and publish and do your own Kickstarters, that kind of thing. But then you're also writing for freelance, as a freelance contractor, then, it just, it piles up. And especially when I'm doing this part-time, but I have a full-time job. I say part-time, I probably put in full-time hours with this also, but this is fun. I enjoy my other job and I enjoy this job. So it's good. It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think, the one thing that keeps me going is I love what I'm doing very much. It's such a strong, I've been gaming since I started playing D&D in 1980 in high school. So going way back to AD&D first edition. And it's just been such for big sections of my life, it's been such a big part of my life. It's been a very important thing for me. And to be able to do this for a living now, to make things that other people will play and hopefully get the same kind of joy out of as the joy that I got out of the products that I was playing back in the day is a pretty sweet place to be.
Now, I know we've got a question already. I'm going to wait and do that later. I'm going to talk to Scott for a little bit, and then we'll answer some questions later, or ask some questions later.
For sure.
But can you, Scott, can you tell me, how did you get into RPG editing?
I got into RPG editing kind of by accident. I had worked in publishing for quite a while. I'd worked in film for quite a while. And it was always kind of just like I'd done production in traditional publishing. I'd done editing in traditional publishing. I'd always been writing my own stuff. I started getting into writing screenplays and got money for it, which was pretty cool. And at one point, I was just sort of I was getting into 3rd edition D&D. I'd stopped playing D&D during 2nd edition, not because of any issues with 2nd edition. I've read 2nd edition, and it's a great game. But it was at that point in time where my original group that I've been playing with since high school, we'd all kind of scattered, and we were all getting busy, right? And then started having kids, and that makes you even busier. And you go into that weird blackout period that many parents go through, where it's like, oh, I haven't seen a movie or watched a TV show in 6 months. What's going on with my life? So gaming was something that just kind of fell by the wayside. And I was just working on some stuff, and I was like sitting at home working one day, and the thought popped into my head completely at random: whatever happened to Dungeons and Dragons? Because I honestly had no idea. I hadn't been to a comic shop in years. I hadn't been to a gaming store in years, right? I was completely out of the loop as far as that went. And this was in 2001. So of course, when I went online to look up whatever happened to Dungeons and Dragons, the first thing that pops up is 3rd edition has just come out, right? And the OGL has just come out. And the OGL, reading about the OGL completely just blew my mind, because the idea that the core engine of D&D had been opened up so that other people could engage creatively with the game was something that was just such an amazing step forward for me, I thought. So I got back into D&D for 3rd edition, read all the 3rd edition books, played a little bit. And during those years, I was reading lots of people in the game writing, their blogs and that sort of thing. And there's an editor named Sue Wainland. Sue may be the best editor to ever have worked in RPG. She worked for TSR for many, many years. She ran Malhavoc Press, which was a 3rd edition imprint back in the day. And on Sue's blog, she had a little thing where she said, hey, I've heard through the grapevine that Wizards of the Coast might be looking for freelance editors. And that was a surprise to me, because I didn't know Wizards of the Coast used freelance editors. I knew they used freelance designers, but at that point I was doing lots of screenplay work. So that's kind of that had sort of scratched that creative itch. And it wasn't something I necessarily thought I wanted to get into at that point in time, but I'd been working in publishing for a long time. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll check this out. So Sue had said, email Chris Perkins and, set this up. And I emailed Chris Perkins, told him who I was, gave him my resume, told him what I'd done, sort of thing. And Chris did three things for me, which were probably the three biggest professional favors, among the three biggest professional favors anyone's ever done for me. The first thing was he emailed me back and said, thanks for your thing. Actually, Sue was slightly incorrect. It's Kim Mohan who's looking after these applications, people who want to work freelance. Second thing he did was he said, don't worry about emailing Kim. I've already forwarded him your stuff, told him I'd seen it, told him it looks good, sort of thing. And then the third thing he said was, make sure you harass Kim constantly because he's really busy. And if you don't harass him constantly, he will not get back to you. And that was important because for me, I'm kind of like, if I'm reaching out to somebody, I'll call you twice. And if I don't hear back from you, I'm just assuming like, I'm probably done, right? You're busy, I'm busy, let's just move on to other things. And it in fact took like 3 emails to Kim, maybe 4, for him to get back to me. He sent me an editing test, which was the most fiendishly difficult thing you can possibly imagine. It was a hard copy test. He mailed me a bunch of pages from the book. It was a 3rd edition, one of the environmental splat books they did, Frostburn, it was called. So it was pages from Frostburn that hadn't been edited yet, and I had to mark them up manually, which I don't know how many people even know how to do that anymore, aside from people who actually go through journalism programs where that is, I think, probably still taught. But because I'd worked in publishing for a long time, I'd worked with great editors, I knew all of that, and I kind of brushed up on it a little bit. So I did that, sent it in, and Kim sent me an email back saying, I like the results of your test. Would you like to edit half of Complete Arcane? And that was I did the test in late 2003, and I started work on Complete Arcane, I think, in February 2004. And
so
just
you've been
at it. 18
years at this.
Yeah.
With Wizards and RPGs.
18 years freelancing for Wizards of the Coast. Yeah. It's just,
that's magnificent.
It is really extraordinary. Yeah. I'm very, very lucky and very privileged to have been able to do this.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And so you've seen a lot of change in the industry. I mean,
oh yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, working on 3rd edition, switching to 4th edition, seeing the process of the D&D Next playtest. Yeah, it's been an amazing. I mean, for anybody who's been into D&D, everybody who watched it just from the outside, it's been a pretty amazing journey. Mm-hmm. Being able to watch some of that from the inside has been equally interesting. It's a kind of an interesting position just being a freelancer. Like I've never worked for Wizards of the Coast. I've never been an employee. I've been to the offices a grand total of twice over the last 18 years because I don't get down to Seattle nearly as often as I should. And it's cool because you get to see some stuff on the inside, but other stuff, you're like everybody else, you're just sort of a fan seeing it from the fan's perspective, mm-hmm. which is kind of nice because you don't know more stuff than you need to know. You just kind of know about the stuff that you're working on.
Okay.
The big thing they're doing next week, this is the first time in a long while that I honestly know nothing about what's coming up. So I'm going to be looking forward to it on Thursday because like everybody else, I get to just basically, sort of just be excited at the same time everybody else is excited because I don't have any clues. I haven't heard any rumors. Everything's just going to be completely brand new for me. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't heard any rumors myself either. It's just, they're always fun. I love those events. Just watch them and
yeah.
Seeing all the new stuff that's coming out and new ideas. And I think it's just streaming and these shows and everything have really brought D&D and it's cool. Yeah. And to have big celebrations about announcements of new products and stuff, it's like an Apple event. I mean, it's awesome.
Really, yeah, it's something that you can't even have thought, like going back 10 years, 15 years. It's almost impossible to have even thought about those sorts of things back in those days, like the rise of live stream games, right? When we were when I was at PAX a few years ago, when the Acquisitions Incorporated book came out, and doing a panel there, and we were talking about like the origins of Acquisitions Incorporated and those first games that they did, right? And I said, while we were on the panel, I said, I listened to that first game because it wasn't even a video recording. It was just an audio thing. The first games that they did with Chris Perkins running for Jerry and for Mike and everybody else. And I said, I remember listening to that thinking, this is really cool. Too bad it'll never catch on.
Right.
I've never been happier to be wrong about something.
Yeah. I love those shows too. Those PAX shows, those are great.
Yeah. They're really great fun.
Maybe someday I'll get to attend a live one, but watching them or listening to them was always fun. And then of course you have Critical Role,
Yeah.
who has just helped. So many things have helped
There's
build
just
this.
yeah, it's a completely different landscape for gaming than it was certainly when I was playing in high school.
Mhm.
Certainly even than it was when I was working on third edition and fourth edition, right? It just everything feels different around the game. The game itself is still cool. You know, the game is what it is. People play it, people love it. There's so much good stuff that comes out of it. There's so many great stories you can tell
Mhm.
as a gamer, right? But the idea that there's now this infrastructure, this landscape around that, where the game has its own kind of social cachet that it never had before, it's a very cool development. And it'd be really interesting to see kind of how that continues.
I have my chat on the other screen, so I'm trying to keep up with everything
Sure.
going on. So I multitasking, you know. Um, all right, so let's get down to the topic of this conversation. Now, I want to talk about editing.
Yeah,
I want to focus on developmental editing, and I also want to focus on keeping the voice of the writer.
sure.
But can you give us a breakdown of each layer of editing, copy editing, developmental,
Yeah,
just a quick breakdown, and then we'll dig into development a little bit more.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, editing for RPG work is a little bit different than for many other forms of writing, many other forms of fiction. But there are some overall similarities. Editing generally is broken down into what you'd call 3 stages. There's developmental editing. Developmental editing usually is the first stage. Developmental editing is where, as an editor, you're focusing not on what you're working on at the sort of like the word level, but kind of at the section level. You're looking at how the different sections fit together. You're looking at how the narrative plays out. And that's narrative in a kind of a wide sense when you're talking about RPG work. A book like an adventure obviously has a narrative of its own. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has certain things certain phases that it goes through, and certain directions that it can take the players in. But even a book like a source book that's mostly focused on like class stuff, new spells, magic items, whatever, it has its own narrative too, because the things that are a part of the game tell their own story. Right. When working on the monster manual, one of the things that I love to talk about is that the monster manual for me is a reference book, but it's only a reference book the second time you read it. The first time you read the monster manual is telling you a story. It's telling you a succession of stories based on what these creatures are and what they do. Right. The monster manual, in my experience, and I mean, things are different now because there's many different ways to access the game. But back in the days when you had 3 core books, and that was how you approached the game. The Monster Manual, in my experience, was the book that made players want to become dungeon masters. Nobody ever picked up the Dungeon Master's Guide and said, "Oh, cool, rules for encounter building. I really want to do this." Right? People picked up the Monster Manual and said, "Really cool monsters. I want to play around with these. I want to build a story around these." Right? So every RPG book has its own narrative, and when you're talking about developmental editing is focused largely on figuring out how that narrative holds together, what kind of shape it is, and how it meshes with the rules of the game for RPG work. And that's a big distinction between developmental editing as it exists in RPGs and as it exists in other forms. Like fiction has story editing and developmental editing as well. Right, the focus there is much the same. You're not worried about the grammar. You're not necessarily worried about like small continuity things. You're looking at the big picture issues, right? You're focusing on how the story flows from beginning to end. You're looking at the shape of it and how it what kind of emotion it builds, and whether it's building it at the correct time and at the correct pace, and how things kind of all lock together to take you from the beginning of the story to the end. An RPG developmental editing is much the same at that, but much more complicated because an RPG book works on so many different levels, whereas a fiction piece generally is just working on the one level of the narration of the story and how the story flows.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're doing developmental editing, you're looking at rules, you're looking at the narrative flow, you're looking at everything as it all kind of ties together. It's like a 3D Tetris sort of a scenario, where all these different things have to slot together in the best possible way in order for the book to hold together in the best possible way. The next stage of editing, both in fiction and in RPGs, is what you'd call line editing or copy editing. And there's a bit of distinction between the two, but for the most part, these days, the terms are used pretty synonymously. right? And that's editing where you're focusing at the level of the sentences and the words. You're looking at grammar, you're looking at the flow of things, you're making sure that the words are sort of appealing as they're laid down, right? That the reader is engaging with them, is going to engage with them properly. But because this is RPG editing and there's the extra level of complexity, you're also worried about things like rules language and mechanical language, right? And a big part of line editing or copy editing for RPG stuff is actually making sure that the rules language adheres to the way that the game is written, which is often different from the way we play the game, right? Like when we're sitting around the table and we're talking about certain things, we use certain turns of phrase, we use certain words that the game doesn't use in that way, right? And it's very important to make sure that what's going into a book reflects the way the game is written so that it matches up to other books that have come out so that everything has a sort of a consistency to it, right? And the final stage after that is the proofreading stage. Proofreading stage is generally one that takes place not during sort of like the word stage, but after everything's gone to layout. And proofreading is the final stage where you want to make sure that everything you could possibly have missed in the previous stages gets caught by somebody, right? Proofreading is the one stage where it's very, very important that ideally you want to have a different person proofreading a book than the people who worked on it as editors.
Sure.
Because editors at some point get into the same problem that writers have. Like the reason that editors are necessary, the reason that good editors can do what they do, is that as writers, we always have sort of blind spots that we can't look at. We have spaces in the text that that we can't focus on as well as we should, right? We have things that we look at them and they look fine to us, but they're actually not fine because there's a difference between the story that's in our head and the story that's going down on the page. And it takes somebody with some fresh eyes, the editor, to come in and look at that and to maybe spot where there's some problems. And then you need a proofreader to come in and spot the things that the editor missed. Because at some point as an editor, when you've been working on a book for many, many, many hours and through many, many, many revisions, you get to a point where you stop seeing it as clearly as you need to as well. And so a proofreader is sort of the last line of defense that kind of comes in and sort of makes sure that everything that you looked at, all the tweaks that you made, all the adjustments that you made are doing what you wanted them to do as an editor.
So what do you edit in? Do you edit in Word?
I edit in Microsoft Word, partially because I've been using Word for a long, long time and I'm pretty familiar with it, partially because that's what Wizards of the Coast uses, right? If you're working for a specific company, right, they will have a specific set of parameters that they want you to follow. They say, this is the app that we're using and you need to use that program. They'll say, this is the style guide that we're using. They'll give you the style guide. You need to adhere to that style guide. They'll say, this is the dictionary that we're using. You have to use that dictionary, even if it's one that you don't personally like. As in my case, I'm not a big fan of Merriam-Webster's. I much prefer the Oxford American, but Wizards of the Coast uses the Merriam-Webster's. So the Merriam-Webster's is what you want to use if you're doing, certainly if you're doing a project for Wizards of the Coast. But even working on D&D stuff for other publishers, I will often say to them, you should probably use Merriam-Webster's even if you don't normally, because that way everything's going to be as consistent as it can be between your books and the books that Wizards of the Coast is putting out, right? You don't necessarily want to create confusion there by doing something that a Wizards book isn't doing. Even like minor spelling and grammar stuff, it's nice if there's some consistency there.
And then when you edit, do you track changes or do you just make the changes and pass them on?
I always track changes. I mean, that's pretty common that most publishers, most people you work with will want you to track changes because they want to be able to kind of just look at the process you went through. There are problems with that sometimes just because, especially editing RPG stuff, again, as separate from editing fiction, the editing process gets so complicated sometimes that when you actually look at a document with track changes open so you can see everything, it's just nothing but scrambled eggs. It's just like word salad everywhere, right? It's like red and it's like this it's like somebody just like tossed a bunch of red and blue words onto your screen in no particular order. And it can get very, very difficult to actually parse that. Right?
Yeah, which is why a lot of times when I have that, I'll download a copy, accept all changes, and then read it that way. Because it makes it difficult for me to read all the changes and all the lines and everything.
Yeah, never ever read your work or work in track changes mode so you're seeing the changes. Always work in final copy mode in one way. Like Word has a couple of different ways you can do that, right? Track changes is useful if you want to go back and see what something was originally. Like something that I'll do, many times an hour when I'm working is I'll be working on something, even something that I've edited once already, and I'm doing a second pass through it, and I'll go, something about this seems off. I'm going to go back to the original. And you just highlight the whole thing, flip it back to original, see what the original was, and say, okay, I see what I did here the last time I came through it. And maybe that was a good thing, and I've just forgotten why I did it. Or maybe I did something I thought, oh, actually, that was my first idea, but a second idea, now I can think of a way to do that slightly better.
Yeah.
Right? No, never, if this needs to be said to anybody, don't ever work in track changes mode, like with track changes on. It's a reference thing. You pop into it to look at it, and then you pop out of it as quickly as humanly possible. Right?
And I didn't really know I didn't use track changes until I started RPG writing. I didn't, most of the stuff that came back to me from other things that I had worked on, with office jobs and that kind of thing, mostly were just hand edits, printed out, somebody making an edit there, and you go back and correct it. So until when I really started writing, I have to deal with the, Google Docs and Word editing and all that kind of stuff. So that really, without having the background in it, that was really difficult to kind of learn how to deal with.
I know lots of people use Google Docs, and I absolutely understand why. It's wonderful to have an app that a whole bunch of people can look at the same document at once. It's great that it doesn't cost them anything. Google Docs is not, for me, is not a really great, robust platform for doing RPG writing. One of the many things it doesn't do is its lack of customizable style sheets is a huge problem, right? And if you're doing an RPG book, especially like if you're doing an RPG book and you say, okay, we want this 5th edition compatible book to look like a Wizards of the Coast book in some way. Wizards of the Coast has a very set group of styles, right? And you simply cannot duplicate all of those using Google Docs. Right. You have to kind of fudge it. You have to kind of work around it. And there's a lot of formatting stuff. Like I'm working on a project right now that started out in Google Docs. So the first thing I do with the publisher's permission is to bring it into Word and restyle everything, which is like a solid 3 hours of work at the very beginning of the project. Just trying to clean everything up, trying to make sure that the character styles, the bold and italic character styles, are set up properly. Because to do proper RPG stuff, especially if it's going into something like InDesign for layout, you got to make sure that you're using styled italic and bold and inline subheads. You can't just turn the bold and italic on and off, right? Lots of little tricks that go into RPG book, and Google Docs doesn't do all of them, I guess is the best way to put it. There's a few things that it fails at.
I've learned that. Yeah, I would, when I first started collaborating, I was a Word guy. And so when I would email off a document to someone, it would come back as a Google Docs. And I'm like, what happened? Where'd my template go? So then I'd have to move it all into Word, which doesn't, copy and paste right, and have to change the formatting on stuff. So yeah, I understand why Google Docs works well. And so if you have if you have the knowledge ahead of time that you're going to use Google Docs, it's easier, I think, to import it into a Word doc or another.
It absolutely is, yeah. I mean, it's good, yeah. For people that are using Google Docs, one of the best things you can do is to set up styles in Google Docs that are going to map as closely as possible to what you're going to be doing in Word at the point when you take your Word document and you bring it into InDesign for layout. I'm not assuming that everybody does that. It's not written in stone that that's the way RPG books need to be done. But certainly it's probably the most popular way, and it's certainly the way that most of the bigger companies at least are doing things, just because it works really, really well.
Right. No, I completely understand.
So yeah, I mean, the one thing you can't do with Google Docs is to set up the character styles. But if that's the only thing you need to worry about when you bring it over into Word, that's a pretty quick thing to fix. To switch those styles over. If everything else is already done ahead of time, that's good. If you get a Google Doc, which I did actually on another project I worked on, that I'm working on right now, which comes in just with the entire document as normal, right? That gets really tough, because you start having to do things like, okay, what's the font size that they used for their equivalent of the header one? Then you need to find all of those, highlight them all, and then turn them into the style that you want to turn them into. And you do that laboriously for every single style in the whole
Yeah.
whole doc.
That's why it's great if you're hiring people, freelancers, send them a template. Create a template so that they don't have to do all the work, and it saves you time on the backside too.
Absolutely, yeah. Knowing how to use styles, whether you're working in Google Docs or whether you're working in Microsoft Words, knowing how styles work, style sheets work, knowing how to apply them, knowing how to use them and why you're using them is a really, really important thing. And that's something like lots of people who, they may have been using Microsoft Word for years, but until you get into a situation where you have like a template where you've got 15 or 20 different styles in it, you may not have been exposed to that, to that sort of thing. So it's really, really important to kind of wrap your head around that. Talk to people who've done it, get some advice. If you're absolutely brand new to it and you're like, I see these styles here and they're freaking me out, there's lots of people out there who would be very, very happy, myself included, to just kind of walk you through and just say, this is the point of what we're doing with the styles. This is why they exist. This is what we want to do with them. And this is why it's important.
Yeah, I hear it's very important when importing into InDesign to have those correct. So
yes.
Okay, we are at the halfway point here, unless we go longer than an hour, which I wouldn't mind because Scott's got all kinds of information to share with us.
Yeah.
But there's something we really need to talk about, though, is it's Jenny Loveday's birthday. And I think she's 21 today.
Again.
So, yeah. So, Jenny, happy birthday to you. I mean, what better way to spend your birthday than hanging out with Scott and I talking about RPG stuff, right? And then another thing is I donate $20 to a charity for every guest that's on the show. And Scott has chosen the RPG Creators Relief Fund. And so I will make a donation to that after the show. And Jenny, for her birthday, if you would like to help her celebrate, would like you to donate to your local animal shelter, or your favorite animal shelter, and support those poor little puppies and kittens that don't have a home.
And the rest of the animals. There are more animals than dogs and cats, but yes.
I'm going to say no to the snakes. I'm not a snake fan, so I can't help support those. But
say no, say yes to supporting the animal shelters and keeping the snakes out of Jeff's house.
That's right. Please, please, please. And you've got some happy birthday wishes in the chat too. Look at that. Everybody's celebrating Jenny.
But more importantly, while I'm co-opting everything here, I'm going to drop that link for the RPG Creators Relief Fund so everyone can check that out and see what really cool things Scott is donating to. And then I'm going to disappear back to the background again. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye, Jenny. All right. So let's get to a couple questions, and then we'll get into some more discussion.
Yeah,
So DDS D&D, his question: what can a writer do to help the editor do the best job they can?
Yeah, it's a really basic question. There's no strong like checklist of answers, unfortunately. A lot of it depends on the project you're working on. As a very general set of guidelines, though, understanding the style sheets, making sure that you're using styles properly and correctly, which we talked about a second ago, is very high up on the top of that list. Because that's one thing that an editor, like any good editor knows how to fix styles that are badly applied, right? But it's extra time that you're taking away from the editor when they could be working on other stuff, right? And anything you can do to make the editor's job easier will make the editor a happier person. And a happy editor is one who does a good job on your stuff. In terms of RPG work specifically, a few things that I often talk about. One is to, as much as humanly possible, try to make sure you give yourself enough time to work on what you're working on. And this is a problem for a lot of folks because I'm luckier than most people. I get to do this full time. This is my job, right? A lot of people who are doing RPG work, we're doing it as like a labor of love. We do it because we get so much joy and satisfaction out of it. But that means we're balancing it on top of our day jobs and our roles as parents or caregivers, and sort of it's the odd hours and I've got 30 minutes here where I can work on something, or, I'm home from work and I'm exhausted, but I've got to write another 1,000 words on something, right? But it's really, really important working even within that framework to try to make sure you give yourself enough time to work on what you need to work on. If your deadline is like a Friday, okay, you should look at that and say to yourself, Thursday is the day that I want to be doing my last read through of my draft, which I finished on Wednesday or Tuesday, right? If your deadline is Friday and if you finish writing your draft at 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday, I promise you your editor will know that. They'll look at your work and they'll go, oh yeah, I see this. It doesn't happen a lot, but it happens once in a while, you know, and you learn to recognize it. And the problem with that is, if you're rushing the work, if you wind up in a position where you're struggling to find the time, then the work that you're doing is not going to be your best work. And when an editor is faced with something, they look at and say, I know this person is better than this, right? It puts them in a position of having to second guess more than is healthy as to what the writer's intent was. And that's where you can get into problems sometimes, because you'll end up having your stuff changed more than you might want to, or more than it should have been if you'd had the time to sort of focus on it the way you should have. A corollary to that is, if you're in a position where you honestly think you don't have time to do the work that you're being asked to do, talk to the person that you're working with about it, right? Just say to them, you know, is it, you know, this project sounds great. The deadline you've given me might be a little tight. Is it possible to extend it? Right? If you're in a situation where you know you're not going to meet a deadline, don't be afraid to talk about that. Okay, it's a really tough thing to do emotionally, viscerally. It's really, really hard to reach out to someone and say, I've kind of messed myself up here with other stuff and I haven't been able to do as much on this as I want to. But it's much, much better than the alternative of telling someone on the deadline day that you're not going to be able to turn over, or worse, just ghosting them and ignoring emails saying, hey, just checking in to see how things are going, and then turning it over whenever you have the time to turn it over. Right. I know how difficult it is to experience. I know how difficult it is to tell people something that where it feels like you're letting them down. But I also know from the other side, people are very rarely actually let down by that. Everyone understands the process. Most people doing RPG work at any company are people who have been through the same process as a freelancer that you're probably going through as a freelancer. Right. So don't be afraid to talk to them. Don't be afraid to kind of keep those lines of communication open, which is yeah. And that in and of itself is also another piece of really good advice, is just talk to the people you're working with, right? I've said this before a bunch of times, but if you have questions about the project, ask those questions. Reach out to the people, reach out to the lead or the lead designer or the publisher or whoever's the point person that you're working with on a project, and say to them, hey, I've got some questions about what we're doing here. Want to make sure we're on the same page. Want to make sure I'm doing exactly what you want me to do, right? And there's a real reluctance for lots of folks to do that, because I think a lot of us feel like if I do that, I'm going to be admitting that I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, I'm going to be, you know, like I shouldn't have to ask for more information about something. I should be able to handle this the way that it is, right? But I say this from experience. I have never once heard anybody on the other side of it, like a lead designer or a publisher or the editor, if you're working directly with the editor on something, I've never heard anyone say, I worked with this person once and they were really good, but they just asked too many questions all the time, right? Literally never heard anybody say that. I have heard several people say, I worked with this person and their work is really good, but it's not quite what we wanted them to do, and we've had to go in and do a bunch of stuff to it as a result of that, because they weren't quite clear on what the brief was. They weren't quite clear on what we wanted them to do, right?
Yeah, and as a project manager and producer and people and someone who hires freelancers, I want people to ask me questions, because I think it clarifies it. So I have less work to do when I'm just going through and doing the developmental part of it, and then pass it on to the editor. It's clearer if we get that out of the way ahead of time. Yeah.
One other thing that's very, very specific to RPG work, and this is something I'm sure we'll touch on again as we're speaking, is the idea that the language of the game as it exists in the game is very often different than the language of the game as we play it at the table. And it's really, really important to understand those distinctions. It's really, really important to use the game as it's written as a reference for what you're doing, right? I'm trying to think of the best way to define this. There are terms in the game that we use all the time when we're playing that do not exist in the game in that exact way, right? A couple of really obvious ones. If we're playing at the table, saying half damage, right? I make a saving throw, I take half damage. That's, everybody says that. That was the usage in 3rd edition, might have been the usage in 4th, I don't remember. People who've never played 3rd edition or 4th edition will say that at the table, right? The game does not say half damage. The game says half as much damage, right? And it's a small, subtle thing, right? But it's a thing that your editor is going to fix every single time if you don't make that connection, right? One of my favorite ones is the phrase natural 20, which everybody says, right? It's been a part of the games for, for pretty much its entire existence, certainly from the late AD&D stage. I'm not sure which the first book it actually appeared in, but certainly as a concept, right? 5th edition does not use the phrase natural 20, right? That phrase does not occur anywhere in the core books. I think it may occur, probably might have snuck into some other book at some point, but it's not a part of the rule set of the game. The game simply talks about if you roll a 20, right? And that's the usage there. So if you're writing, and you're writing something that's going to happen when the player rolls a 20, right? You have to know what the proper usage of that is. It's good to understand what the books are saying, as opposed to what we instinctively all want to say. Another one that's really common is the abbreviation PC for player character, right? The abbreviation PC for player character has not existed in D&D since partway through 4th edition, even. It was phased out even before D&D Next and 5e came onto the scene. But it's something that you still see all the time because it's been part of the game for so long. So many people are used to it. People are used to saying it at the table, right? And it becomes something then that your editor has to fix, right? Even the phrase player character doesn't exist that much in D&D. It's used once in a while when you need to distinguish between a player character and a non-player character. But for the most part, player characters are now just characters, right? And there are literally hundreds of little tiny finicky things like that are part of the way the game is presented in the books. And it's really, really important to try to wrap your head around those as a writer, right? And to spend time reading the books as a writer, not just reading them as a player, but sort of going through them and getting used to the language of the game as it's presented on the page, and making sure that that's the language that you're writing in as often as you can.
So if you came across somebody who wanted to change the style, so we're not writing for Wizards. We're writing our own book, our own 5th edition, and we think that our style is better. We're going to get rid of. We're just going to put DCs in a parenthesis. We're gonna make all that. How do you feel about that? What would your words be to them?
Absolutely fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Any good style guide will tell you, here are the suggestions we're making. Anything you want to change, that's fine. If you have a reason to, just make sure you do it consistently. Okay. D&D has a style guide, right? The style guide, there's a style guide that exists. I think there's a version of it that's on the DM's Guild. I don't know how up to date it is, but it's the same general thing that if you work on a project for Wizards of the Coast, they will send you a copy of this, like the most up-to-date version of it, which has sort of like the different rules for usage and a few like words that are sort of like spelling exceptions that aren't in the dictionary and that sort of thing. And it's pretty comprehensive. It'll sort of tell you what you need to do in a general sense. It's not a replacement though for kind of like for knowing what's in the books, but anything you want to change, that absolutely fine. The only trick is make sure you're doing it consistently, and also be aware of what might happen if players who are used to the way things are done in D&D books have to come across this now and they see it presented in a different way. A really good example is MCDM's new monster book, Flea Mortals. If you look at the MCDM preview, the preview package that they did when the Kickstarter was live, they've come up with a new way of talking about if you have an effect that's on your character, or if a monster imposes an effect on a character, you make a saving throw again at the end of each of your turns, and on a successful save, the effect ends, right, or the condition ends. That's been in 5th edition right from the beginning. It's in all the Monster Manual monsters. It's in all the monsters that have appeared since then. MCDM, looked at that and said, this is an awful lot of words for something that shows up an awful lot of times, and maybe that's something that's a good idea to shortcut. So they've done a shortcut version of it, and it's a really good solution. I think it works quite elegantly. The problem is going to be, is everybody who picks up the MCDM book going to understand what this says right off the top, or is it going to confuse them? Right.
Exactly.
And that's the question you always want to ask. Yeah. Whenever you want to deviate from standard style, the question you want to ask is does this have the potential to confuse people? And if it does, do we have a place in the book where we can explain it clearly enough, where everyone will see it and where everyone will understand why we're doing this?
Exactly. Yep. That's been my concern with it too. Is we have these core books that people are reading and using, and when we deviate from those, we have to the DM or the player then have to figure out what we're trying to do if it's not explained correctly.
Yeah.
So
One of the
sticking
other
with the style guide.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'll add one other thing in here as well, just to make that dictum even more complicated. The idea of kind of like looking at the books and making sure you understand the way the game is phrased, right? The phrasing, the words that the game uses, is that style changes subtly over time. So you want to also make sure you're looking at recent books, not just looking at the core books, right? One example is in older monsters. Very often had abilities that would, sorry, not older monsters, older ancestries would often have abilities. Monsters and ancestries, I guess, would have abilities that would recharge after a long rest or after a short rest. So if you hop in there and you're like, oh, I'm looking through my monster manual and I'm like, oh, everything's long rest or short rest. This is great. I'm going to write up a monster for a Wizards of the Coast project I'm doing, or for a third-party book that I'm doing, and this thing's gonna recharge on a long rest or short rest. And then you look at Monsters of the Multiverse and you realize that Wizards of the Coast may have killed that mechanic in favor of, you can use this ability a number of times per day equal to your proficiency bonus, right? And it's a subtle thing. It doesn't make a huge difference in terms of how the game is played or the mechanics of it, right? But it does seem to be a change that they've made at sort of like the foundational level of monster and ancestry design. Right. And if that is the case, then you got to look at that and you have to say, okay, is this something we want to do going forward? That's actually a question that I've raised with a couple of people for books that I've been working on with other companies, non-Wizard stuff, pointing out to them that, you know, we're doing it the old way. Do we want to change to the new way? Right. Change to the new way means that you're compatible with Monsters of the Multiverse. You might be compatible with what Wizards does next, whatever the next adventures are that come out. Right. But at the same time, what you're doing is going to look different than what was in the original monster manual.
Right.
And
if the people never pick up the new books, then yeah.
So it's an impossible needle to thread sometimes. But the general idea of making sure you're familiar with the game as it's written, not just with the game as you play it, is a really, really strong piece of advice for anybody who wants to write for D&D, whether for Wizards of the Coast or for anybody else doing D&D stuff. It's something to keep in the back of your mind.
All right, so I want to jump up to the voice of the writer.
Yeah,
and I want to know, because I am not an editor. Okay.
Yeah.
I edit some things that I do that I hire freelancers for, just to give it a pre-edit before I send it off to my editor. I consider myself more of a developmental editor, but and when I'm writing or when I'm editing these projects, I'm like, am I imposing my voice as a writer into their product? Yeah. And so I don't. That's why I don't like two-line edit or copy edit. I don't. I have my own style for writing. Sure. And so I want to know: is there a way to keep that, or because some people might say, well, this isn't how I write. And there's incorrect writing, and then there's correct writing and just a different style. Yeah. So how do you maintain the voice of the writer when you're editing?
Doing that is probably one of the hardest parts of RPG editing. Honestly, it was one of the very first things that I wrestled with when I first started freelancing for Wizards of the Coast, and I did some third edition stuff for some other folks as well. But it's something that I feel like I'm pretty good at, just because I've been doing it for as long as I've been doing it. But it's still always a real challenge, right? One of the things to think about, I guess, is the idea of what the writer's voice is and what that means in terms of the product that you're writing for, right? There are certain areas, certain types of products, certain types of writing where the voice of the writer should absolutely be sacrosanct, right? You have no reason to want to mess around with it. If you imagine like a fiction anthology of short fiction, right? No fiction editor would ever go through that book and say, okay, I'm going to make a bunch of changes here because I want the stories to all sound more like each other.
Okay.
Right? A collection of essays, right? You don't want to mess around with the voice of each of the individual writers, because that's part of what people are picking up this book for, right? They want to hear those voices. They want to get a sense of, this person is speaking to me directly, right? RPG books are different than that and more complicated than that. And as a result, there is a problem with authors' voices, designers and writers, voices sometimes getting lost, or certain things that a writer is trying to do that ultimately kind of get ironed down a bit, or the sort of like the edges get filed off to some degree. right? Where it's like, okay, this is what I wrote, but it's not exactly what I wrote. It's not the way that I wrote it. One of the first things to think about, one first things to understand is if this happens to you as a writer, it's not a personal thing, okay? This is not generally a matter of an editor saying, you know, I really wish I'd written this, so I'm going to rewrite it the way that I would have written it, okay? I've never done that as an editor. No good editor that none of the editors that I know, none of the editors that I've ever worked with would do something like that, right? But that said, there is a need for RPG books to have a kind of a consistent voice and a consistent tone. And that's something that an editor has to do. And that's one of the toughest parts, is sort of juggling this need to have a sense of consistency across an entire book with the idea that, you know, we want to allow the writer's voice to still be there. We want the writer's voice to kind of shine through, even as we have to make adjustments to sort of fit things in to this book in a particular way. From a writer's perspective, I mean, there are a couple of other areas where this sort of thing is also kind of plays in, but though they're certainly not as common now as they would have been back in the day. Certain magazines, if you're writing for a magazine, certain magazines have a particular type of voice, okay? If you were writing a story about, I don't know, say like a band, okay, for your local daily paper, the voice in that story is probably going to be very different than if you were going to write that same article for something like Rolling Stone.
Right.
Okay. Rolling Stone has its own editorial voice. It has a particular style to its stuff. And if you're writing for Rolling Stone, you can say to yourself, I'm going to try to write in that particular style. I'm going to understand what their voice is. I'm going to try to follow that voice, or to use it as a framework, as a guideline for what I'm doing, right? You can do that with RPG works up to a certain point as well, and it's an important thing to do that. If you're writing a particular type of book for a particular type of publisher, or for a specific publisher, look at the other stuff that they've done that's like that, okay? If you're writing monsters for Kobold Press, for example, Kobold Press does great monster books, right? Look at the monster books that they've put out. See what they do in terms of the style, see what the range of it is, and then figure out a way to sort of try to keep that in mind as you're working. Okay, if somebody wants to write for you, you've got great adventure books that they can and should read before they have any interest in or any hope of doing anything for you. Because if they come in and just do something that doesn't fit what you want them to do, that's a problem, right? If you're being given a specific template, if somebody says to you, here's what we want this to look like. This section is going to be 200 words. This section needs to be 400 words. This section needs to be 250 words, okay? And they need to run in this order, and we want all three of these sections, right? That's a really important thing to stick to, right? Use that as your starting point. Because one of the easiest ways to have your authorial voice, your writer's voice, your designer's voice messed around with is not adhering to the guidelines that you're being given by the person you're working with, okay? Many examples I can think of this. Just, I mean, the most basic one is probably not hitting your word count, right? If you're asked for 1,000 words and you turn over 2,000 words, there's a 100% chance that your voice is going to go out the window.
Yeah.
Because in the process of turning 2,000 words into 1,000 words, something's got to give, right? If you're being asked to write something in 3 sections and you decide to add a 4th section, that's a problem, because if the 4th section just gets cut entirely, it may make changes necessary to the other sections, okay? One of the big problems with that, though, is that even if you're very good at adhering to that, even if you do your diligent best to write what you've been asked to write in the format that you've been asked to write it, RPG publishing by its very nature is extremely chaotic as a process. And there's still a big chance for things to need to get altered or updated or fixed or tweaked at the end of the day. RPG books, I think more than any other, I can't think of any other form of writing that has the mix of art and text that an RPG book has. And what this means is that when the text, even after the text is edited, when it goes onto the page, okay, there's another editing process, sometimes done by an editor, sometimes just done by a layout person, usually done by whoever's the project lead on the book, right, who will be an editor or a designer of the book, right? And they will do the copy fitting stage. And at the copy fitting stage, if they asked you for 1,000 words, and if your 1,000 words was absolutely perfect, but it turns out that your 1,000 words needs to go into an 800 word space on a page, then 200 words of your 1,000 words has to go. And that's got nothing to do with you, okay? Your work was awesome. It's just part of the nature of RPG publishing. It's a very strange, very chaotic kind of creature, right? And it has its own set of demands that most other forms of writing don't have, right? Newspaper writing, probably the only thing that comes close. Magazine writing, I guess, back in the day when people wrote for magazines, back when there were magazines. If you're on Twitch, ask your parents what a magazine was.
Right.
You know, those sorts of things happen. Like you'd be asked to write a 4,000 word piece, but then they get an extra ad sold, right? So that ad goes into your thing, and you suddenly, you know, there's 250 words that have to go out of it, right? That kind of stuff happens, right? It's more acute in RPG work, I think, because RPGs have a much less flexible layout, especially when you get into things like with lots of headers, lots of sidebars. All of those things make it much more difficult to let copy flow naturally. So you have to sort of look for breakpoints where you're gonna kind of cram things in, where you're gonna switch from one section to the next, right? And all those things make it very, very difficult to predict ahead of time how a writer's words are going to fare at the end of the day when they go through the final stages of the process, when things end up down on the page. I guess that it's a difficult situation, and it's a difficult scenario, because it's entirely reasonable for an RPG writer to say, okay, knowing all of this, knowing that even if I do my best work still might get tweaked to a point where I'm not happy with it, or where I don't like it, or even, as has been the case sometimes, where somebody just says, I don't like anything about this anymore. You've turned it into something that I didn't set out to do.
Exactly.
Right? Which happens from time to time. It's really easy to look at that and to say, as a writer, maybe I should just stop doing my best work. And I would urge anybody who feels that way to not do that, because your best work ultimately at the end of the day will shine through. It will get you more work. It will get you into positions where you can do better stuff. One of the other things to think about is that this kind of scenario is most acute for larger publishers who are doing big books with multiple writers on them, right? That's a situation, like for me as an editor, a book that has a whole bunch of different writers on it, one of the most challenging things is trying to make it sound like the book was written by one person, at the same time as letting the individual writers' voices come through. It's a huge challenge. It's probably the most difficult part of what I do. Right?
Yeah, after you know, reading many of the adventures that several freelancers have written before they wrote for WotC, you know, several freelancers have come from the Dungeon Masters Guild. I've worked with them. I've read a lot of their products, and there are points within some of the adventures that WotC has put out that I can kind of catch the voice of some of these other writers, and you can tell differences between the different stories. But I don't think they've been large enough so far that, that it's been an issue. I think it's things like Candlekeep Mysteries and Radiant Citadel. Those things are probably more easier, or to keep the individual voice within those adventures, possibly.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, Radiant Citadel was a book that I did a lot of work on, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and it's an amazing project. And anybody who hasn't checked it out yet absolutely should. Yeah, I mean, that's an example of a book where the individual voices were important. That was part of the project brief. That was part of what was that was the foundation of the book, right? But even with that, there's still the need to make sure that each of those voices is sort of worked through the language of the game as it exists, the stuff I was talking about earlier, right? And invariably, sometimes even in small ways, right, the language of the game may change the perspective or change the flex on the writer's voice, right? And that's a necessary part of RPG work. There's no real way to work around that, aside from, as was said, you know, making sure that what you're writing is as close to the language of the game as you can possibly make it right from the outset, so that there's less opportunity or less excuse for someone else to need to play around with it. Another further wrinkle, sorry, just to make this rambling conversation even more complicated. In addition to the editing stage, development is another thing that exists in RPG books. And development and developmental editing are not the same thing. You might have the same person doing both of them for certain books, but development is focused more exclusively on the rules, right? And this is where things can really go haywire, because if you're working on a project and you don't have the opportunity to work with a developer while you're working, right, what will often happen is you'll write something mechanically, whether it's like a class feature if you're doing a book of subclasses, or a monster ability if you're working on a book of monsters, or if you're writing an adventure, a certain trap that functions a certain way, right? And the developer, when they go and look at it, they may say this is not quite working the way the game needs it to work. Okay, it might be something basic like it's doing too much damage, right?
Right.
Or it's being used too often, or it may interact with another thing that's going on in the adventure in the wrong way, or something you have absolutely no control over as a writer. This is great, but something like this is appearing in another book that's coming out 2 months from now that you don't know anything about and have no opportunity to find out about, right? And so development often will make its own set of changes, and those are things that then come to the editor. The editor has to work with those, so the editor has an extra voice now. You got the developer who's made changes to mechanical stuff as needs be, right? And that just it just sort of it squares the complexity of the project, right? It's why RPG work, I think, I say this honestly, it's the most complicated form of creative media, I think. I don't think there's anything else that even comes close to it.
Yeah, as you've mentioned, there are so many parts to an RPG book. You know, there's the writing, the editing, the layout, the copy layout, or whatever you could call it. You mentioned, you know, to make sure everything fits right. And
copy fitting,
yeah. It's amazing how much work goes into one of these books.
Yeah. One thing I will say after all of that, and I'm hoping I haven't talked anybody out of wanting to do RPG writing with all of this stuff we're talking about. One of the ways to think about dealing with that, one of the ways to make that a less daunting process, is to work for smaller publishers and to work in an environment where you're working more closely with individuals. If you're working on a big book for a big publisher, something that's extremely common, and this is something I didn't even realize when I started editing until after I'd been editing for about a year. That's how common it is, and how strange it is that writers generally will not get asked questions about their writing. Right. Because by that point, the book has moved on past them. There's simply no time. It's not that the people in charge are like, you know, we don't want to ask you questions. We don't want you to have any input into changes we think we might need to make to your work. It's because we literally, I don't have the day it would take to get a response back from you.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, turn your work in and it's gone until you see it in print.
And that's a very frustrating reality, and I absolutely understand the frustration of anybody who's ever dealt with that, because I have dealt with it as a designer. I've done some stuff for Wizards of the Coast, you know, and stuff like that happens. And it's not because anybody is malevolent. It's not because they don't know what they're doing, right? It's not because they're willfully ignorant of wanting to keep you in the loop. It's simply those are the demands of putting a book out at the scale that Wizards of the Coast puts books out.
As a freelancer and a writer, you want to know you did a good job. You want to know that your words are good. And so if you don't hear anything back, you know, it's like, well, was that any good? You know, you start getting that imposter syndrome. You know,
it's really, but the thing is, I mean, there are other ways to put books out. What works for a big company like Wizards of the Coast, because of, you know, their production schedule and the amount of infrastructure that they have, other people can do different things. And if you have the opportunity to work with someone where you know you're going to get a chance for, like, once the editor goes over your work, they're going to bring it back to you and say, here's some changes that I think need to be made. You know, what do you want to do with these? Right. And it might be a matter of, these are great ideas. I didn't think about that. Thank you for catching it. It might be a matter of saying, no, I don't think that works, but let me come up with a better idea, which will fix the problem that you addressed. Okay. You know, to make it even better than I made it in the first place. Right. But at the end of the day, either way, you feel like you're a part of the process. Right. And being a part of that process is a really, really cool feeling. I mean, I mean, I love the work that I've done for Wizards of the Coast over the years. I really, really like working with people individually, with working people directly, right? Working on a book where I actually get to editing a book where I actually get to talk to the writers, and I get to actually confab with them about what they're doing, how it's working from their perspective, how I think it's working, changes that I think might need to get made, because that doesn't happen very often, working on projects for Wizards of the Coast, simply because of that's the nature of the way books work at Wizards of the Coast. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, right? It's not like they're doing it, you know, for reasons of intentionally wanting to cut people out of the creative process. It's just a necessary evil, right? It's a part of what.
Yeah, it's like, I haven't worked with Cobalt Press or Obsidian, but I imagine they have kind of the same process where, you know, you turn in what you are hired to write, and then they take it from there because they're making the big books too.
Yeah, I don't know about Cobalt Press. MCDM, interestingly, has a very different approach. If you talk to anybody who's written for Arcadia, and I think the process for the monster book will probably be the same. I wrote 2 books, or two books. I wrote 2 monsters for Flea Mortals, and I haven't heard anything back on them yet, but I imagine after playtesting, it may be the same sort of thing. If you write a piece for Arcadia, they will come back to you with the edits, and they will say, what would you like to do with this? And you have a lot of control over that. And it's a sea change in terms of the way things have traditionally been done in RPGs. And it's something certainly that I hope more people will kind of adopt. The problem with it is it's a process that requires a lot of time, and it's a process that requires a lot of resources. Okay, I can say this honestly as an editor. This is not a good thing or a bad thing. It is what it is. It's faster for me to fix something that I see in somebody's draft that looks like a mistake than it is for me to ask them what they want to do with the mistake.
Yeah.
Right. And very often for a lot of projects, that time frame, having to get something done in a very timely fashion, means that's the shortcut you have to take.
It's the same thing with Kickstarters too. If you are hiring out writing for those, a lot of the Kickstarters have deadlines which people try to meet, and sometimes they don't always meet. But you run into the time issue where there's not always the time to go back and say, this is what we want to do. What do you think about that? So luckily I've had great people that have written for me. Any changes I've had to make have always just been accepted. A couple of times I've gone back and said we need to change this a little more, but that takes a little bit of the time away from the other projects. And it's just easier. So definitely writing to template, writing to word count is a must. Even if you have to cut that thing down, you wrote 2,000 words and you cut down by 1,000, make the cuts that way. That way your voice is going to stay.
Yeah, one thing to think about as well, like if you're working for a publisher and you say to them, hey, I'd love a template, for this thing that I'm working on. If a publisher tells you we don't have a template or don't worry about it, that's one of those things where you want to probably ask more questions, right?
Right.
Ask them exactly, look at stuff they've done before. If they say, what we're looking for is just exactly the same thing as we did in our last 2 books, right? That can become your template. If they say, don't worry too much about it. If it's a publisher who's like, we're putting this out as print on demand, maybe it'll be a 64-page book, maybe it'll be a 94-page book or 96-page book. That's probably okay, because if you write a little bit longer, they may be okay with that. They may be like, oh, this is great writing. If it's a little bit longer than we expected, we'll work with that, right? We can make that a part of what we're doing, right? Again, there's many different ways to put books out, right? That's one way, and it's an entirely effective way. But by asking questions, you want to make sure that you're not in a position where a publisher simply doesn't know what they want. Because a publisher who simply doesn't know what they want is one who may end up mucking with your stuff pretty severely, because they're going to figure out what they want to do after they've seen the work you've done for them.
Right.
And that's a really tough thing to have to go through as a writer.
Well, Scott, it's been great having you on the show. We're already at past an hour, so this has been a great discussion. I've enjoyed having you. Lots of great knowledge, great stories from you, and
very much enjoyed being. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you tell people where they can find you again?
Again, Twitter's usually the best place to find me, where I am Scott F. Gray. Twitter has my link to my website, I think, insaneangel.com. My DMs on Twitter are usually open. My website's got a contact link if anybody wants to get in touch for any reason. I'm always happy to hear from people. I kind of I'm sort of in an isolated corner of Western Canada. I don't get out to conventions very much or at all. So I like interacting with people who are, doing stuff that relates to what I'm doing. I love to hear from people who've, played stuff that I've worked on and enjoyed it. I love to hear from people who are thinking about getting into it. I'm happy to dispense whatever dubious advice I can dispense. So yeah.
Well, I think you've probably got enough to we could have you on another show. So I'll jot that down for the future. Yeah, I appreciate it. Absolutely. No, it's been great. I mean, your name is. I don't know how many people look at editors, credits in books. I do, but I'm also an RPG writer, and so you kind of gravitate to those credits a little bit more. But knowing your background, it's just been a joy to first for you to say, yeah, you'd be on the show, and second to have you on the show. It's been great talking to you. So.
I'm really happy to be here.
And I am Jeff Stevens. You can find me on Twitter at jcorbinstevens. I also have a Kickstarter that is in pre-launch, Horror at Devil's Run. It's a 5e Kickstarter. And, going back to the developmental editing thing, even now it's gone through so many edits, and I'm sitting here in pre-launch thinking, I could have done this, I could have done that, I could have done this, could have done that, and I don't think anything is ever complete. There's always something that but that's for the DM to kind of push around and kind of use their own.
Yeah. I mean, talking about adventure editing is its own, and writing is its own discussion entirely. Which, if you ever want to have me back, it might make a good topic to talk about, because adventure writing is even more complicated than any of the stuff we've been talking about today.
We could probably have you and Teos on, and then we could kind of break down one of Teos's adventures while he was on the show. I don't know if he's still in the chat or not, but no, Scott, again, thank you very much. And to all you listeners and watchers, I want to say thank you for watching the show, and happy birthday, Jenny Loveday.
Happy birthday, Jenny.